As of right now, it looks like at BetMGM, it's pretty much everywhere. Georgia is a 12.5-point favorite, down from the open. Total sitting right around at 62.5 at BetMGM. Let's break this down first with when TCU has the ball, and then we'll do when Georgia has the ball. So we've seen some passing offenses exploit this Georgia secondary. We've seen Ohio State do it with explosive plays. TCU certainly has very talented receivers on the outside that are capable of hitting explosive plays on a fast track. And then you have Max Duggan and his legs, big factor against Michigan. What can Duggan do with his legs here? Is he going to have enough time? Because Georgia team doesn't get elite pressure. Part of that's by design. And can their receivers make enough plays on the outside to either keep up or beat Georgia? So what do you see when TCU has the ball against this Georgia defense that is definitely not in the same conversation as last year's historically dominant unit?
I think the first thing we do is we recognize the fact what little baby brother Riley has done, what Garrett Riley has done as offensive coordinator, because when you think of Sonny Dykes, you think Mike Leach and you think air raid. And, Mike Leach's basic concept back in the day was if there's a light box, we're going to run. Otherwise, we're going to throw it, 2x2 or 3x1, whatever. We're going to throw it a lot, right? And TCU has not fit that mold whatsoever. 55% rush does not fit an air raid. And so you go into Garrett Riley's offensive coordinator, Garrett Riley, little brother of Lincoln Riley. You go into his history. He was the receivers coach at East Carolina for Zay Jones, who's now, 115 targets, I think, for the Jaguars right now. He then went on to win the Sun Belt as a running backs coach at App State in 2019. I mean, that was the last time you and I were hot on App State, was when Riley was there. And so, Sonny Dykes scoops him up, brings him to SMU, and all of a sudden we're looking at an air raid that is based on the ground attack. And that's exactly what's happening here. TCU offense goes on what the defense gives you. You put 6 in the box, they're going to throw. You put 5 in the box light, and they got 5 offensive line, they're going to run the ball. So to say that we know that a certain running back or a certain wide receiver is going to get, enough carries or enough targets, it's a little bit less predictable with TCU because it depends on what the Georgia defense is going to give you. So I think we'll start there. Georgia's defense runs the mint front. And if you're wondering what that is, they got the nose tackle, and then they got the 2 defensive tackles that line up on the inside of the tackles. And then they're going to have like a jack linebacker standing up trying to rush. But I think the big key is that Georgia's going to bring 4. Then it looks like they're going to bring 8, but they're only going to bring 4 in pressure, and they're going to drop everyone back into quarters pressure. So they'll have 3 instead of 2 eye safeties. They'll go with 3 safeties, and they'll have 4 underneath. And what that's going to do, Stuck, is allow the 0 to 10 yards be wide open. And that is where I started to fall in love with TCU and their offense in this game. If you look at where TCU attacks the field, it's 0 to 10 yards in between the hash marks. And the 2 biggest targets are Quentin Johnson and Savion Williams. They have more than 25% of their targets in that area. If you look at rushing attempts with Kendra Miller, it's all over center, left of the center, right of the center, it's over the middle. So when you look at that, that is the area to attack the quarters coverage. That is the area that, if you go back to the Tennessee game, that's what they tried to do. They tried to go underneath and then allow their receivers to do the work after the catch. I venture to say that TCU has more explosive players. I don't think anybody's faster than Darius Davis. He's going to post probably the fastest 40 time at the NFL Combine. Quentin Johnson is an absolute machine since his injury at Texas. That is his zone. And I think the big player on this offense that you have to watch for, and that I'm trying to weave into some props if we can get him in there, is their tight end, Wiley. And I think where Wiley becomes so important to their offense is because he is the reason they're 10 personnel when they line up with 4 wide receivers, or he motions in and then they play 11 as the tight end. And then him and Kendra Miller or, Amari DeMarcado act as blockers for Max Duggan. So again, I go back to this. If there's 6 or 7 guys in the box for Georgia, TCU elects to run, they can bring Wiley, the tight end, in and have him as a blocker. They're going to have DeMarcado act as a blocker, and then Max Duggan gets to run. So I would say that the biggest offensive weapons that we're going to see out of TCU is going to be.
Do you think it matters if Kendra Miller's status, or does Deep
So
Mercado
there
fine?
there is some talk out there that I heard about how Kendra Miller is explosive, can run. If you look at DeMarcado's numbers, he's actually better yards after contact. He just doesn't have as many attempts. He has half the attempts that Kendra Miller has. I think from a running the ball standpoint, TCU is just fine. From a blocking aspect, the worry was DeMarcado came in there and Michigan just blew him up, and Max Duggan got wiped on a sack. If you go into PFF grading, both Miller and DeMarcado have the same blocking grades, the same run blocking grades. I think it was just a missed assignment. I don't think there's that big of a drop off. I know Kendra Miller is unbelievable to watch, but DeMarcado has been just as good. And you can't say that this kid's not fired up. He's from Inglewood, California. He's playing 5 minutes from his family. So it's a really big game for him. And so I don't think it's that big of a drop off. Now, from a props perspective, we'll get to later. I'm not touching anything with Kendra Miller. Not an over, not an under, not anything until we know his health status. Knee injury listed as questionable. He has been cleared to play the game, but it's just a variable that you and I can't handicap until probably I'm standing on the field at SoFi and seeing if he's making any cuts, which we'll get to Lad McConkey later because I got comments about that too. So I think from the TCU offense, it's hard to predict who's going to get a maximum amount of carries, who's going to get the touches, who's going to get the receptions. But I do love Quentin Johnson getting the ball over his prop. I like Max Duggan running the ball. I think if Georgia flashes that mint front and they load the box, you're going to see Wiley, you're going to see DeMarcado go in blocking, you're going to see Max Duggan run the ball. And the big stat that you need to watch is that Max Duggan scrambled a lot this year. He does have designed runs, right? He does call his own number and take off. Against Michigan, 13 rushing attempts, 11 were designed runs. That was his season high. Never even came close to that. I don't think he had designed runs over 5 in a game ever. So he called 11 designed runs on himself, or Garrett Riley put them in for the play. I think that continues here. I think he's
a high leverage game. He got healthy over that month, and
it'll be the same.
Yeah, it'll be the same thing here. Everything is on the line, and it's worth mentioning it because I like Duggan over rushing yards too. Georgia 94th in sack rate this year. Yep. They're not a team that's getting tons of sacks, which is important because sacks count against your rushing yards in college.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. The one thing I do worry about the rushing prop, knees. We know the Patrick Mahomes knees in the Super Bowl count against you. Sacks count against you in college for your rushing yards. I do like Max Duggan to score a TD. We get down to the 1 yard line. Maybe there's a penalty, a PI, whatever. We get down to the 1 yard line. It's going to be a sneak, especially with Kendra Miller not there and not healthy. Max Duggan is the next man up who's taking that sneak over, and prayers to Max Duggan with Jalen Carter hovering over that middle. But that is going to be the play. So I do like a Max Duggan anytime TD in this game. I support the rushing yards. I would worry about the knees if TCU wins this game, but we'll talk about it at the end.
And you think that TCU can have success here ultimately?
Absolutely. And it's because, and I see the steam in the over in the market, and I think that's because people think this could be a shootout like both the Peach Bowl and the Fiesta Bowl are. But if Georgia is going to go, if they're just going to sit back in quarters coverage with 3 safeties and 4 linebackers 15 yards off the ball, then you are going to get another Tennessee game, which went under the total. And the reason is because they did not want to allow the big play. If Georgia
they just get more methodical drives, clock's bleeding. And then, you have 1 or 2 of those where it ends in like a missed field goal or turnover. All of a sudden, you're pretty much drawing dead with an over in the mid-60s.
And I love Quentin Johnson's number of receptions to go over 4.5. His yards, is he going to be able to bust a big one? Right now, you just watch highlight reel from last week, you're going to think he does. But if Georgia is committed to protecting the explosive play, you might not get those yards, which I believe our Bet Labs has projected at 68, and the market is sitting around in the 80s. So I'm not going to touch Quentin Johnson's yards, but his over 4.5, definitely, I'm in.
So the other side of the ball, when Georgia has it, so one of the reasons I really liked Ohio State was that I thought that they had 2 safeties who were very strong in coverage, and they could match up with Georgia's tight ends. They run 12 personnel at the 3rd highest frequency in the country. 2 excellent tight ends, and Ohio State had 2 safeties who can at least match up as well as anyone else can, and they did for the most part. Now, and Ohio State's weakness was on the outside at corner. Ultimately, it ended up costing the game, but that's not going to kill you against Georgia. So that's one fear that I have here for TCU's defense is that their strength is on at cornerback, right? Josh Newton, who plays primarily wide corner, Trevius Hodges Tomlinson, who primarily plays in the wide corner. Then you have Bud Clark, who's primarily in the slot, and Kamara, who's in the slot and a free safety. That's, those are 4 of their 5 highest graded defenders, all corners on the year in that 3-3-5 defense. So their strength on the outside, it's not as important as it neutralized here because that's not how you have to shut down Georgia. So can they match up, and what we've seen them now against Michigan, and then also if you go back to the game against Texas, they were able to adjust. They have a really great defensive coordinator in Joe Gillespie, who we respect. They were able to adapt and, shut down some of the best backs and rushing attacks in the country. But can they match up with Georgia's tight ends? That is my fear here because, if you look back at, first of all, if you look at their corners aren't going to be able to match up with their tight ends one-on-one. They're just too small. You need someone that has size and agility and athleticism. And that's TCU's weakness on defense in coverage is at linebacker and safety. So that's what concerns me going up against Brock Bowers. And then Darnell Washington, who's injured, I think he's going to play, but he might not be fully healthy. If you go back and look at all the tight ends that TCU face, and they don't face many, like their defense is built to stop the spread in the Big 12. Like Oklahoma State doesn't use a tight end. West Virginia doesn't use a tight end, right? And if you go back, but if you look at all the tight ends they faced, all but one went over their season-long average in yards when against TCU this year. And they went over by, I think, an average of 25 yards, which is a huge number. The only one who didn't go over was by 2.6 yards. And people forget that Schoonmaker for Michigan, their tight end, got hurt last week. He only played 10 snaps at 1 catch for 31 yards. His backup came in at 4 for 35. And if you look at the good tight ends that TCU has faced, right, there's only 52 tight ends in college football this year that had over 300 receiving yards. TCU faced 4. Jatavian Sanders for Texas, who went off. Ben Sinnott for Kansas State, who got hurt in the first matchup in the first set. So you throw out that game, but in the Big 12 championship, had about a season average. And, then you had Schoonmaker who got hurt, and then Mason Fairchild, who exceeded his season-long average by a wide margin. Those, tight ends averaged, I think, 4 catches for 60 yards and 0.7 touchdowns. On the season, they were about 3 for 37 and 0.4 touchdowns. Now you're going up against Brock Bowers, who is arguably the best tight end in the country, and his numbers would be even better if Georgia wasn't in a lot of blowouts. So I love, I just mentioned those tight ends who are not in the same stratosphere as Bowers, and they averaged right around 60 yards against TCU. I love the Bowers over, especially with Washington, who might not be fully healthy. So maybe he's in there to block as a decoy and he doesn't get as many targets. I love Bowers in every way. Favorite prop is over his reception yards. That's my biggest concern is, can TCU match up with these tight ends? Because I do think that they'll be able to play man on the outside with their corners against these Georgia receivers, which isn't their strong suit. And then it's okay, can you fit to the run? And you want to really commit to the run as they've done against these teams who have great rushing attacks. But then there's how do you cover Bowers when he's in the slot? Bowers might even get some rush attempts here. He had a rush touchdown and a 70-yard rush. So, I love Bowers in every way possible. That's what scares me about this TCU's defensive matchup. I liked it a lot better for Ohio State. So I do think Georgia's going to have success with those tight ends and their unique matchup, which can create matchup nightmares for opposing defenses. What do you see here when when Georgia has the ball?
100% agree, and tons to add to this. So Schoonmaker, I'm watching Michigan go up and down the field and just kick all these field goals. Their first explosive pass went to their tight end Schoonmaker. If you look at what Schoonmaker did for Michigan, he was the first one that had the explosive pass. They motioned him in to the fullback, and he is the blocks that were set to get Donovan Edwards free on those huge runs. So go back and watch the film. The way that Michigan used the tight end at the beginning of the game is exactly what they're going to do with Brock Bowers. And Brock Bowers is he has to be an animal in this game for Georgia to win and cover this game. Now, as far as the outside, I'll take a page, out of your book from the semifinals. These TCU corners, they're going to jump routes. They're going to give up explosive plays, but they're going to jump routes. I believe AD Mitchell will have an explosive play. So from a long, he hasn't had in his career a reception longer than 40 yards. And I think his longest in the playoff was about 22. But if TCU is going to gamble and roll the dice and jump these routes out there a corner, some of it's going to pay off with interceptions. Some of it's not. So I love a Stetson Bennett interception prop, which I believe is
same.
Yeah, which is I believe about minus 110, even though if you go into our bet labs, it probably should be about plus 120. But Stetson Bennett is having severe issues without Ladd McConkey health. And I think we should talk about there's 3 injuries here that we really need to pay attention to. One is the right tackle for Georgia's offensive line, one of the best blockers on the team. That affects the running game because Kenny McIntosh loves to run over tackle over the tight ends. But the biggest injury is Darnell Washington. It's not even close. He is the second best run blocker on this team. And if you go into grading, it's far beyond anything that they've got on their offensive line. If you go to Kenny McIntosh's running, 33% of his runs are over tight end. He loves to hit the edge and follow up on these huge tight ends, especially Darnell Washington. Darnell Washington yesterday, today's Thursday, Wednesday, Darnell Washington was talked about by Kirby Smart, said that it's not an ankle issue. He has a soft tissue issue. You go watch the film, his foot got stepped on pretty bad. Maybe the cleat went through the foot, went through the skin. I don't know, but he hobbled off and now he is called, I don't even know what this is, if it's questionable or doubtful, he's called hopeful. If you look at the downgrade, it's freshman Oscar Delp. Minimal playing time, a couple of catches against South Carolina in week 3. He's been in 74 running plays. He's one of the worst graded blockers on the Georgia offense. So the downgrade here, I mean, we're talking like baseball value over replacement player. No Darnell Washington, monster loss. Now, I'm not just talking about production out of Darnell Washington because he's only been averaging like a target to 3 targets in these games. From a blocking perspective, Georgia has to move from a 12 to 11. And if you don't understand what that means, they have to go from a 2 tight end set to a 1 tight end set. And if you know anything about schematics in football, 12 personnel can hurt 3-3-5 defenses. And that is a major disadvantage for Georgia. If Darnell Washington is not playing and he is not blocking, that is a huge advantage for a 3-3-5 defense of TCU, who can focus on Brock Bowers, jump routes on AD Mitchell, and just watch Stetson Bennett's eyes about Ladd McConkey. Now, Ladd McConkey is the last one we got to watch. Go and watch all the pregame warm-ups from the Peach Bowl. McConkey is he's barely
limping around.
He's just limping around, no cuts whatsoever. And then the one catch that he had, I think he had 4 targets, 2 catches for -1 yards, and he made that 2-point conversion. But when did that 2-point conversion come? In the 4th quarter, when Ohio State just completely forgot about him. He was a non-factor. He can't cut on his knee. And Kirby said that he is in pain. If he plays, he will be in pain. This is not the Ladd McConkey that leads Georgia in targets. This is not the Ladd McConkey that gets the ball, gives you a triple juke, and then takes off. And that is I'm trying to like ride the fence of I've loved TCU all year, but there are serious issues on this Georgia offense with a right tackle being injured, Darnell Washington, soft tissue in his foot, and Ladd McConkey leading in targets, not there for Stetson Bennett, who for some reason, Brock Bowers was the safety blanket for Stetson Bennett last year. This year, it's been Ladd McConkey. He has been the first look all the time. Now, if he's not there, notice what Stetson Bennett did against Ohio State. 2 turnover-worthy plays, an interception, should have had about 3 interceptions in the game. He was lost looking at targets outside of McConkey. And if Brock Bowers is being double-teamed in 11 personnel, because TCU can do that, it's tough for Stetson Bennett, and it's going to be tougher for the Georgia offense. So in the action app, you guys saw that I took 13.5 on TCU on open. Just shove the money. All these variables were in my head right after the game. Shove the money. I knew this was going to bounce in a neutral zone. Personally, I will tell everybody I'm going to be on the field during warmups at SoFi Stadium. I am going to be there to look for the biggest human on the field, which is Darnell Washington. I'm going to watch Ladd McConkey warming up. And when I do that, I will make my decision whether I'm coming back on Georgia. And anybody else that tells you anything different does not know. Kirby Smart's not going to let that information out. You're not going to see these guys on a practice field. Anything else you hear is going to be a smokescreen. 90 minutes before the game, Colin Wilson's going to be on the field reporting on Darnell Washington and Ladd McConkey and if they're cutting on the field.
Yeah, and the tackle. So yeah, I agree with you. I'm going to wait on some injury news to see if I pull the trigger on the side. As of right now, I haven't played anything. I don't like anything. The total, I make that 63.5. So nothing there. And then all the props that we've talked about we're in agreement on.
Let's talk about this real quick. Let's say we don't have injury news, and then the heavy, I mean, it's Vegas weekend here. The heavy money comes in on Georgia, and we get a 14 on the board. Do you, without injury news, do you fire on TCU just to get the 14, or are you going to sit back?
Yeah, I would probably play 14 small. And I do expect Georgia money to come in dependent on injuries.